The scream tore through the great hall, before Lyra Hartwell even understood what was happening. Every eye in the room turned toward her, and she felt her knees threaten to give out beneath her. Callan Voss stood only a few feet away, his jaw tight, his eyes cold in a way she had never seen before. Moments ago she had believed this night would be the happiest of her life. Now she understood it would be the night that broke her. The pack had gathered for the annual bonding ceremony, a tradition where fated pairs stepped forward to confirm their union in front of the entire community. Lyra had waited 5 years for this moment, ever since the bond between her and Callan had first appeared. She had told herself the wait was simply due to his duties as Beta, that timing had never been right, that patience was a virtue every Omega had to learn. She had believed him when he said he needed more time. She had not expected him to use that time to fall for someone else. The woman standing beside him now was named Odessa Vance, daughter of a neighboring pack's alpha, dressed in silks that shimmered under the torchlight. Her smile was sharp, aimed directly at Lyra, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. Callan cleared his throat, and the sound echoed unnaturally loud in the silence. "I reject you, Lyra Hartwell," he said. The words landed like physical blows. A rejection was not simply a broken engagement. It was a public declaration, one that stripped an Omega of her place in the pack's hierarchy, one that marked her as unwanted in front of every wolf who had ever looked at her with respect. She felt the weight of dozens of stares pressing into her skin, some pitying, some cruel, none of them kind enough to matter. Her mother, standing near the back of the hall, brought a hand to her mouth. Her father did not move at all, his expression unreadable, though Lyra knew he would never speak of this night again once it ended. Shame did strange things to people who valued reputation above comfort. Odessa stepped forward and placed a hand on Callan's arm, a gesture meant to look protective but designed purely for display. The pack elders murmured among themselves, already recalculating where the young Omega now stood in the delicate structure of status that ruled their lives. Lyra did not cry. She would not give them that. Instead, she straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and turned toward the enormous double doors at the end of the hall. Each step she took echoed against the stone floor, and though her heart pounded so hard she thought she might be sick, her face remained calm, almost distant, as though she had already left this place in her mind, long before her body followed. Nobody stopped her, nobody called her name. She walked until she reached her family's modest home at the edge of the territory, and only then, behind a closed door, did she allow her legs to fold beneath her. She sat on the floor of her small room, staring at the pale moonlight spilling through the window, and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. She was no longer someone's intended. She was no longer someone with a place. She was simply Lyra, rejected, marked, and alone. For a long while, she considered what her life would look like now. Omegas who were rejected rarely recovered their standing. Some stayed within the pack anyway, enduring quiet humiliation for years. Some left entirely, giving up their wolf identity to disappear into human society, where pack rank meant nothing. Lyra had always thought such a choice sounded impossible, even cowardly. Now it sounded like freedom. She rose from the floor, wiped her face though there had been no tears to wipe, and began pulling a canvas bag from beneath her bed. She packed only what she needed, a few changes of clothing, a small amount of money she had saved from selling bread at the market, a photograph of her grandmother, the only relative who had ever told her that her worth was not determined by anyone else's opinion. She paused at her bedroom door, listening for movement in the house. Her parents were likely still awake, processing the scandal that had just unfolded in front of the entire pack, deciding how they would explain her absence to their neighbors. She decided she would not wait to hear their explanations. She would not wait for anyone's permission to leave. The night air outside was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. Lyra walked to the edge of the territory boundary, marked by an old stone wall that had stood there longer than anyone could remember. She had crossed that boundary countless times as a child, chasing rabbits or picking berries, always with the comfort of knowing home waited behind her. Tonight, she crossed it knowing she would not return. She did not look back at the lights of the pack houses glowing faintly behind her. She did not allow herself to imagine Callan's face, or Odessa's satisfied smile, or the pitying stares of people she had once called neighbors. She focused only on the path ahead, illuminated by a moon that seemed brighter than she remembered, as if urging her forward. Hours passed as she walked, her feet aching, her mind numb with exhaustion and disbelief. She passed through forests she barely recognized, crossed streams that soaked her boots, and finally, as dawn began to break over distant hills, she saw the outline of a town unlike anything she had seen before. Small buildings with human architecture lined a quiet street. A bakery sign swung gently in the early breeze. A group of humans walked past without sparing her a second glance, too consumed with their own lives to notice the exhausted young woman standing at the town's entrance. For the first time in hours, Lyra allowed herself a small breath of relief. Nobody here knew her name. Nobody here knew she had been rejected. Nobody here would judge her worth based on a title she no longer held. She stood at the edge of the town, watching the sun rise fully over rooftops that had nothing to do with pack politics or faded bonds, and made herself a quiet promise. She would build something here, something entirely her own, something no one could take from her with a single sentence spoken in front of a crowd. She did not know yet how difficult that promise would be to keep, nor did she know how long it would take before her old life would find her again. But standing there, watching the town wake up around her, she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt like she finally belonged to herself. Millhaven was nothing like the world Lyra had left behind. There were no pack elders watching her every move, no whispered rankings determining who deserved respect and who did not. There were only ordinary people going about ordinary lives, unaware that a rejected Omega now walked among them, trying desperately to become one of them. Her first days in town were the hardest. She had no money for lodging beyond a few coins, no connections, and no plan beyond simply surviving one day at a time. She spent her first 2 nights sleeping in the back corner of an abandoned barn just outside the town limits, wrapping herself in a thin blanket she had packed without knowing exactly why. On the 3rd morning, hunger drove her toward the small bakery she had noticed on her first day in town. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the open door, and though she had barely enough money to buy a single roll, she stepped inside anyway. Behind the counter stood an older woman named Margaret Dunlow, her apron dusted with flour, her expression sharp but not unkind. She looked Lyra over for a long moment, taking in her wrinkled clothes and tired eyes, before speaking. "You look like someone who has not eaten properly in days," Margaret said. Lyra opened her mouth to explain, though she was not sure what story she intended to tell. Before she could speak, Margaret waved a hand dismissively. "Save your excuses. I do not need them. What I need is someone willing to work in exchange for food and a place to sleep. My last helper left without warning, and my knees are not what they used to be." Lyra accepted before Margaret finished the sentence. The work was harder than she expected, waking before dawn to start the ovens, kneading dough until her arms ached, learning the rhythm of a business that ran on precision and patience. But for the first time since the ceremony, Lyra found herself thinking about something other than her own pain. The repetitive motions of baking, the simple satisfaction of pulling a perfect loaf from the oven, gave her mind somewhere else to rest. Margaret never asked about her past, though Lyra suspected the older woman understood there was more to her story than she let on. Perhaps it was the way Lyra flinched whenever someone raised their voice nearby, or the way she avoided eye contact with strangers who looked too closely at her. Margaret simply let her work, let her heal in silence, and slowly, weeks turned into months. Lyra rented a small room above the town's only bookstore, owned by a soft-spoken man named Elias Pruitt, who often left novels outside her door when he noticed her interest in a particular title. She began spending her evenings reading by candlelight, losing herself in stories about places far removed from anything she had known. She made a few friends during this time, though she kept most people at a careful distance. There was Nora Whitfield, a seamstress with a bright laugh, who worked 2 doors down from the bakery, and Simon Aldridge, a young farmer who delivered fresh milk to Margaret's shop every other morning. Neither of them knew anything about wolves or packs or fated bonds. To them, Lyra was simply a quiet newcomer who worked hard and kept to herself. She liked it that way. Still, there were nights when the old wounds resurfaced without warning. She would wake suddenly from dreams she could not quite remember, her chest tight, her breath uneven, as though her body still carried the memory of standing in that hall, while Callan's rejection echoed through the crowd. On those nights, she would light a candle and sit by her window, watching the quiet street below, until the panic subsided. She never allowed herself to dwell on what her life might have looked like had things gone differently. She refused to imagine herself standing beside Callan as his mate, refused to picture the life she had once believed was waiting for her. That version of her future was gone, and dwelling on its absence would only slow the healing she desperately needed. Instead, she focused on small victories. The day Margaret finally trusted her to manage the shop alone for an afternoon. The day she baked her first loaf without a single flaw. The day Nora invited her to dinner and Lyra realized, for the first time in months, that she had laughed without forcing herself to. A year passed in this manner, each day a small brick laid carefully atop the last, building something steady where there had once been nothing but wreckage. By the time the second year began, Lyra had saved enough money to consider a future beyond simply surviving. She began helping Margaret expand the bakery's offerings, introducing recipes she had learned from her grandmother, recipes with subtle spices that gave the bread a flavor unlike anything sold elsewhere in town. Customers began traveling from neighboring villages just to taste her creations, and slowly, quietly, the bakery's reputation grew. Margaret, now well into her later years, began speaking more seriously about the future. "You have a gift for this," she told Lyra one evening as they closed the shop together. "When I am gone, I want this place to continue, and I do not know anyone more capable of running it than you." Lyra had not expected such an offer, and for a moment, she found herself speechless. She thought of everything she had lost in the pack, the home, the status, the future she had once imagined, and here, standing in a modest bakery, in a town that had nothing to do with wolves or bonds, she was being offered something entirely her own. She accepted, understanding fully the responsibility such trust required. Over the following months, Margaret began teaching her the finer details of running the business, from managing supplies to handling difficult customers with patience rather than frustration. Lyra absorbed every lesson eagerly, determined to prove that Margaret's faith in her had not been misplaced. She still carried her wolf nature quietly beneath the surface, though she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge it. She kept her senses dulled, her instincts suppressed, treating that part of herself as something better left buried. It was easier that way, she told herself. Easier to pretend she was simply human, easier to avoid the reminders of everything she had left behind. Yet even buried instincts have a way of stirring when least expected. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when Lyra caught herself listening a little too closely to distant sounds beyond human hearing, or noticing scents carried on the wind that no ordinary person should have been able to detect. She always pushed these moments aside quickly, unwilling to entertain the idea that her old life might still be part of her in ways she could not fully escape. By the time 2 full years had passed since the night of her rejection, Lyra had become someone entirely different from the frightened young Omega who had once stood trembling in a great hall. She was steady now, capable, respected within the small community she had built for herself. She smiled more easily. She slept through most nights without waking in panic. She had, against every expectation she once held for her own future, begun to heal. She did not know that her carefully rebuilt world was about to be tested in ways she could never have anticipated. Nor did she know that the peaceful life she had constructed brick by brick would soon draw the attention of someone whose power reached far beyond anything she had known within her old pack's modest territory. For now, she simply focused on the present, grateful for the quiet life she had earned through nothing but her own determination and grit. 5 years had now passed since Lyra first walked into Millhaven, with nothing but a canvas bag and a broken heart. The bakery, once modest and small, had grown into a beloved fixture of the town, its shelves lined every morning with fresh bread that drew customers from villages several hours away. Margaret had long since retired, spending her days in a small cottage just outside town, content in the knowledge that her life's work remained in capable hands. Lyra now owned the shop outright, her name painted in careful lettering above the door. She had expanded the seating area to include a few small tables where regulars gathered each morning to share gossip over coffee and warm pastries. She employed 2 young assistants, Fiona Blake and Owen Marsh, both of whom had become like family to her over the years. Her life had settled into a rhythm that felt, for the most part, peaceful. She woke before sunrise, opened the shop by 6, spent her days surrounded by the comforting scent of baking bread, and closed each evening with enough exhaustion to sleep soundly through the night. She had built something entirely her own, something no pack hierarchy could strip away with a single public sentence. Yet beneath the surface of her steady routine, certain habits remained unchanged. She still avoided any mention of wolves or packs, deflecting questions about her past, with vague answers about a difficult family situation she preferred not to discuss. She still tensed slightly whenever a stranger's gaze lingered too long, an old instinct warning her that recognition might mean danger. She still, on rare occasions, caught herself listening for sounds beyond ordinary human hearing, though she had grown skilled at dismissing such moments before they could unsettle her. Nora Whitfield, now one of her closest friends, often teased her about her guarded nature. "You keep everyone at exactly the same distance," Nora said one afternoon as they shared tea in the back room of the bakery. "Close enough to be friendly, far enough to never really let anyone in." Lyra had simply smiled and changed the subject, unwilling to explain that her caution came from wounds far deeper than anything she could easily put into words. Nora did not press further, though her expression suggested she suspected there was far more to her friend's story than she had ever been told. Occasionally, Lyra allowed herself brief moments of vulnerability. She would sit by her window in the evenings, watching the quiet street below, and wonder what had become of the pack she once called home. She wondered if Callan ever thought of her, though she quickly reminded herself that such thoughts served no purpose beyond reopening wounds she had worked hard to close. She wondered if her parents had ever spoken of her again, or if her name had simply become something never mentioned in polite conversation. She did not wonder about mates or bonds or the possibility of love. She had decided long ago that such things were not meant for her, that the life she had built alone was the only life she needed. It was safer this way, she told herself. Safer to rely only on herself. Safer to never again place her heart in someone else's hands, only to have it shattered in front of an entire crowd. Word of her bakery's growing reputation eventually reached beyond the borders of ordinary human towns. Travelers who passed through Millhaven often carried stories of the small shop with extraordinary bread, stories that spread through markets and trade routes in ways Lyra never realized. She remained unaware that her quiet corner of the world had begun attracting attention from circles far removed from anything she still associated with her old life. One particular afternoon, as autumn began settling over Millhaven with cooler winds and golden leaves, Lyra found herself unusually restless. She could not explain the feeling, a subtle unease that prickled at the edges of her awareness throughout the day. She dismissed it as simple fatigue, perhaps the result of a long week managing an unusually busy shop. That evening, after closing the bakery and sending Fiona and Owen home for the night, Lyra remained behind to prepare dough for the following morning. The shop was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the ovens cooling and the distant sound of townsfolk finishing their evening errands outside. As she worked, she caught the faintest trace of a scent she could not immediately place, carried on a breeze slipping through the partially open back door. It was unlike anything she had encountered in Millhaven before, sharp and unfamiliar, carrying an undertone of something ancient and powerful that stirred instincts she had long suppressed. She froze, flour-dusted hands hovering above the dough, every nerve suddenly alert, in a way she had not experienced in years. For a moment, she considered dismissing the sensation entirely, convincing herself it was nothing more than an unfamiliar traveler passing through town. Yet something deep within her, some instinct she had buried beneath years of careful suppression, refused to settle. She moved toward the back door slowly, peering out into the quiet alley behind the shop. The street beyond appeared empty, illuminated only by the soft glow of lanterns lining the town's main road. Nothing seemed out of place, no figure lurking in the shadows, no obvious source for the unease still prickling along her skin. She closed the door firmly, locking it despite rarely bothering with such precautions before, and returned to her work with a heart beating slightly faster than it had moments earlier. She told herself the feeling meant nothing, that 5 years of peace had made her unaccustomed to the occasional strangeness that came with living near trade routes, frequented by all manner of travelers. She finished preparing the dough, cleaned the shop thoroughly, and made her way upstairs to her small apartment above the bookstore, determined to put the unsettling moment behind her. Sleep did not come easily that night. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something significant had shifted, though she could not begin to explain why. When exhaustion finally overtook her, her dreams carried fragments of images she could not quite grasp, a pair of eyes she did not recognize, a presence that felt both dangerous and strangely familiar. She woke the following morning feeling more unsettled than rested, though she pushed the lingering unease aside as she prepared to open the bakery for another day. She told herself, as she had told herself countless times before, that whatever remained of her old wolf instincts held no real bearing on the peaceful human life she had worked so hard to build. She had no way of knowing that her instincts, dulled as they were, had sensed something entirely real the night before, nor did she know that the source of that unfamiliar scent belonged to a man whose arrival in Millhaven would soon change everything she believed about the life she thought she had already finished building. For now, she simply opened her shop as she always did, unaware that her carefully constructed peace was about to be tested by forces far beyond anything she had faced since the night of her rejection. Cain Draven had not intended to travel anywhere near Millhaven. His journey had been planned as a routine inspection of territory boundaries along the northern trade routes, a task he had delegated to his generals countless times before, but had chosen to oversee personally this season. As Alpha King of the Northern Packs, ruler of territories spanning further than most wolves could imagine, Cain rarely found reason to concern himself with small human-adjacent towns that held no strategic significance. Yet 3 days into his journey, something had shifted. It began as the faintest trace of a scent carried on the wind, so subtle that his personal guard, a seasoned warrior named Garrick Thorne, had not even noticed it. Cain had paused mid-stride, lifting his head slightly, every instinct within him suddenly alert in a manner he had not experienced in years. "Something wrong, my lord?" Garrick asked, noticing his king's sudden stillness. Cain did not answer immediately. He inhaled slowly, attempting to identify the source of the scent that had captured his attention so completely. It was faint, distant, carried perhaps from miles away, yet unmistakably significant in a way he could not explain through logic alone. He had heard stories, of course, tales passed down through generations of alpha bloodlines, of mates recognized instantly through scent alone, bonds so powerful they could not be ignored regardless of distance or circumstance. He had always considered such stories exaggerated, romanticized versions of a bond that, in his own experience, had never manifested with any real intensity. Until now. "We are changing course," Cain said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded armies and settled territorial disputes without a single battle fought. Garrick raised an eyebrow, but did not question the order. In his years serving as personal guard to the Alpha King, he had learned that Cain rarely acted without reason, even when his reasoning remained unspoken. The journey toward the source of the scent took another 2 days, leading them steadily away from the northern trade routes, and toward smaller, quieter territories, rarely visited by wolves of significant standing. Cain found himself growing increasingly restless as they traveled, his usual composed demeanor replaced by an urgency he could not fully explain even to himself. By the time they reached the outskirts of Millhaven, the scent had grown considerably stronger, though still carrying an elusive quality that made it difficult to pinpoint its exact source. Cain instructed his guard to remain at the edge of town, unwilling to draw unnecessary attention, with an entourage suited more for royal courts than quiet human settlements. He entered Millhaven alone, dressed in simple travel clothing that gave no indication of his true status, his presence nonetheless commanding enough that several townsfolk paused to glance in his direction as he passed. There was something undeniably powerful about the way he carried himself, a quiet authority that seemed to demand respect without requiring a single word. He followed the scent through the town's main street, past a bookstore, past a seamstress shop, until he found himself standing outside a small bakery, its windows displaying an assortment of bread and pastries that smelled faintly of the exact scent that had drawn him across such considerable distance. For a long moment, Cain simply stood outside the shop, uncertain how to proceed. He had never in his life felt so completely uncertain about a situation, a sensation that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He had led armies without hesitation, negotiated treaties between rival packs without flinching, yet standing outside this modest bakery, he found himself hesitating like an inexperienced pup. He pushed the door open finally, stepping into the warm interior, filled with the comforting aroma of fresh bread. Behind the counter stood a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, her attention focused on arranging a tray of pastries. She glanced up as the bell above the door chimed, offering a polite, practiced smile toward what she assumed was simply another customer. Cain felt the air leave his lungs entirely. There was no mistaking it now. The scent that had drawn him across such distance belonged unmistakably to her, stronger now than he had ever imagined possible, wrapping around his senses in a way that left him momentarily unable to speak. "Welcome," the young woman said, her voice pleasant, though carrying no particular recognition of the significance of the moment unfolding before her. "Can I help you find something?" Kane opened his mouth, searching for words that seemed to have entirely abandoned him. He had faced hostile alphas without hesitation, yet standing before this unassuming young woman, in a simple bakery, he found himself utterly at a loss. "I would like to try your bread," he managed finally, the words feeling absurdly inadequate given the magnitude of what he had just discovered. The young woman nodded, moving to retrieve a fresh loaf from behind the counter, entirely unaware of the storm of realization currently unfolding within the man standing before her. Kane watched her carefully as she worked, studying every detail of her movements, searching for any sign that she recognized what he now understood with absolute certainty. There was none. She moved with the easy confidence of someone entirely comfortable in her own life, someone with no awareness whatsoever that the man standing before her held authority over territories she likely could not even imagine. She handed him the wrapped loaf, accepting payment with polite efficiency, her expression giving no indication of anything beyond the ordinary transaction between shopkeeper and customer. "Is there anything else?" she asked, glancing toward him with mild curiosity, likely wondering why he continued lingering, rather than leaving with his purchase. Kane hesitated, uncertain how to proceed without revealing far more than he was prepared to explain in this moment. "What is your name?" he asked finally, the question feeling both entirely inadequate and desperately important. The young woman's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of caution crossing her features before she answered. "Lyra," she said simply, offering nothing further. "Lyra," Kane repeated quietly, as though testing the weight of the name against everything he now understood. He left the bakery moments later, the loaf of bread held loosely in one hand, his mind consumed entirely by the realization that had just upended every expectation he held about his own future. He had spent years believing the stories of instant recognition were exaggerated, believing that whatever fate intended for him would arrive through more measured, deliberate circumstances befitting his position. Instead, fate had led him to a small bakery in an insignificant border town, placing his mate behind a counter, selling bread to unsuspecting travelers, with absolutely no awareness of who he truly was. He returned to where Garrick waited at the edge of town, his expression carefully composed, despite the turmoil still churning beneath the surface. "We will be staying in Millhaven for the foreseeable future," Kane said simply. Garrick studied his king carefully, noting the unusual intensity in his expression, though he asked no questions. In his years of service, he had learned when silence served better than curiosity. As the sun began setting over the quiet town, Kane found himself standing at a distance from the bakery, watching through the window, as Lyra moved efficiently through her closing routine, entirely unaware that her carefully constructed peaceful life had just encountered something capable of changing everything she believed about her own future. He did not yet know how he would approach this situation, how he would explain his identity without frightening her away entirely, or how he would navigate a bond she seemed entirely unaware existed between them. He knew only that he could not simply walk away now that he had found her, regardless of how complicated the path ahead might prove to be. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the Alpha King felt uncertain about his next move, and strangely, he did not mind the feeling nearly as much as he expected to. Lyra noticed the stranger from the very first day, though she could not explain exactly why he lingered so persistently in her thoughts, long after he had left her shop. There had been something in the way he studied her, an intensity that felt entirely different from the polite curiosity most travelers offered when passing through an unfamiliar town. She told herself it meant nothing, that he was simply another visitor, drawn by the bakery's growing reputation, and yet when he returned the following morning, ordering the same loaf and lingering slightly longer than necessary, she found herself unable to dismiss the strange awareness prickling beneath her skin. His name, she learned eventually, was Kane. He offered nothing further about himself, no mention of where he traveled from or what business brought him to Millhaven, though his manner of speaking carried an unmistakable air of authority that seemed entirely out of place in her modest shop. He returned nearly every day that week, always ordering something simple, always lingering afterward in conversation that gradually grew longer with each visit. Lyra found herself, against her better judgment, looking forward to these brief exchanges. though she remained cautious enough to keep their conversations firmly rooted in safe, superficial topics. "You seem to know a great deal about bread for someone who claims no experience baking," she remarked one afternoon, watching him examine a tray of cooling pastries with unusual interest. Kane offered a faint smile, the expression softening features that otherwise carried a certain sharpness she found difficult to ignore. "I have spent considerable time around people who value craftsmanship," he replied vaguely, offering no further detail. Lyra studied him for a moment, noting again the careful way he avoided specifics about his life beyond Millhaven. She recognized the behavior easily enough, having spent years crafting similarly evasive answers about her own past. "You are hiding something," she said finally, though her tone carried curiosity rather than accusation. Kane's expression shifted slightly, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes before he composed himself once more. "Perhaps we both are," he replied quietly. The comment lingered between them longer than either seemed prepared to address, and Lyra found herself unexpectedly flustered by the implication, quickly busying herself with rearranging items behind the counter to avoid meeting his gaze. Despite her efforts to maintain careful distance, she noticed herself responding to his presence in ways she had not experienced in years. Her senses, dulled deliberately for so long, seemed to sharpen whenever he entered the shop, as though some dormant part of herself recognized something significant about him that her conscious mind refused to acknowledge. She dismissed these sensations as simple attraction, an entirely human reaction to a man who carried himself with undeniable confidence and quiet strength. She refused to entertain any possibility beyond that, having long ago convinced herself that anything resembling fated bonds belonged firmly in her past, a chapter closed permanently the night Callan had rejected her before an entire pack. Yet the feeling persisted, growing steadily stronger with each visit Kane made to her shop. One particular evening, as she prepared to close the bakery, Kane arrived later than usual, his expression carrying a seriousness she had not seen from him before. "I need to speak with you about something important," he said, his voice quieter than his usual measured tone. Lyra felt her guard rise instinctively, old instincts warning her that important conversations rarely led anywhere pleasant based on her past experiences. "I am listening," she replied cautiously, setting aside the cloth she had been using to wipe down the counter. Kane hesitated, clearly searching for words adequate to the significance of what he intended to share. Lyra watched him carefully, noting the unusual uncertainty in a man who otherwise carried himself with unwavering confidence. "There is something about you," he began slowly, "something that drew me to this town, though I did not understand it fully until I found you standing behind this counter." Lyra felt a chill trace along her spine, old wounds threatening to resurface at words that carried uncomfortable echoes of promises once made and broken. "I do not understand what you mean," she said carefully, though some part of her suspected the truth long before he continued. Kane studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal, before finally speaking again. "I believe you are meant for me," he said quietly, in ways that go beyond ordinary circumstance. Lyra felt her breath catch, memories of another declaration made years ago flooding back with unwelcome intensity. She had heard similar words before, had believed them completely, only to watch them crumble into public humiliation when circumstances shifted in someone else's favor. "I do not know what game you are playing," she said, her voice carrying an edge sharper than she intended, "but I have heard this kind of talk before, and I have no interest in repeating that particular mistake." Kane's expression shifted, something like understanding crossing his features, though he did not retreat from his position. "This is not a game," he said firmly. "What I am describing is not something either of us chose, and I understand you have no reason yet to trust what I am telling you. I am not asking you to believe me immediately. I am simply asking you to allow me the chance to prove it." Lyra stared at him for a long moment, torn between the instinct to flee from a conversation that felt dangerously reminiscent of her past, and a quieter, more curious part of herself that recognized genuine sincerity in his words, despite everything warning her to remain cautious. "I need time," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt internally. "I cannot simply accept declarations from someone I barely know, regardless of how genuine your intentions might be." Kane nodded slowly, respect evident in his expression, despite what must have been considerable disappointment. "Take whatever time you need," he said quietly. I am not going anywhere. He left the shop moments later, leaving Lyra standing alone amid the quiet hum of cooling ovens, her mind racing through implications she was not yet prepared to fully confront. She thought of her carefully constructed peace, built over 5 years through nothing but her own determination, and wondered whether allowing this stranger closer would risk unraveling everything she had worked so hard to build. Yet beneath her caution, something undeniable stirred, an awareness she could no longer dismiss as simple coincidence or ordinary attraction. Whatever Kane represented, whatever truth lay behind his careful words, she sensed it carried far greater weight than anything she had encountered since arriving in Millhaven 5 years earlier. She closed the shop that evening in unusual silence, her thoughts consumed entirely by a conversation that had shifted something fundamental within her, though she remained uncertain whether that shift represented danger or the possibility of something she had long ago convinced herself she no longer deserved. The trouble began on a quiet Tuesday morning, when the sound of numerous horses arriving at the edge of Millhaven drew curious townsfolk from their shops and homes. Lyra, standing behind her counter arranging the morning's first batch of bread, glanced up as Nora rushed through the door, her expression a mixture of excitement and confusion. "You need to see this," Nora said breathlessly. "There are soldiers gathering outside the town hall, dressed in armor unlike anything I have ever seen." Lyra felt an uneasy prickle along her spine, instinct warning her that whatever unfolded outside likely connected somehow to the mysterious stranger who had occupied so much of her thoughts over recent weeks. She left Fiona in charge of the counter and followed Nora outside, joining the growing crowd of townsfolk gathered near the town hall. What she saw confirmed her rising suspicion entirely. A group of heavily armed men stood in formation, their bearing disciplined and precise, clearly accustomed to far more serious duties than anything Millhaven's quiet streets typically demanded. At the front of the group stood Garrick Thorne, his expression carrying the weight of someone accustomed to commanding respect through presence alone. "My lord," Garrick called loudly, his voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd, "the council awaits your return at the northern border. Matters of state require your immediate attention." Lyra watched, her heart sinking with dreadful understanding, as Kane emerged from a nearby building, his expression carrying obvious frustration at the interruption. The crowd around her began murmuring immediately, townsfolk exchanging confused glances as they processed the implications of what they were witnessing. "My lord," one elderly woman whispered nearby, loud enough for Lyra to hear clearly. "That is a title reserved for royalty." Lyra felt her stomach twist painfully as pieces began falling into place with unwelcome clarity. The careful evasiveness, the commanding presence that seemed entirely out of place for an ordinary traveler. The way even seasoned soldiers spoke to him with unmistakable deference. Kane was no ordinary man passing through Millhaven. She watched as he addressed his men briefly, his voice carrying easily across the distance separating them. "I will return when matters here are resolved," he said firmly. "Inform the council that any decisions requiring immediate action can proceed without my direct oversight for the time being." Garrick hesitated, clearly wanting to press further, though something in Kane's expression apparently convinced him to withhold whatever concerns he carried. The soldiers eventually retreated, though their presence had already accomplished exactly what Lyra feared most. The entire town now understood, in broad terms, that the quiet stranger frequenting her bakery held far greater significance than anyone had previously imagined. Lyra turned and walked back toward her shop without waiting for the crowd to disperse, her mind racing through implications that felt disturbingly familiar despite their unprecedented scale. She had trusted before, had believed promises made by someone who ultimately proved himself entirely different from who she had believed him to be. Now history seemed intent on repeating itself, though on a scale she could scarcely comprehend. Kane found her minutes later, standing alone in the back room of her bakery, her hands trembling slightly as she attempted to focus on tasks that no longer held her attention. "Lyra," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "I trusted you," she said, her voice carrying more hurt than anger, though both emotions warred fiercely beneath the surface. "You allowed me to believe you were simply a traveler, an ordinary man with no complications beyond whatever brought you through this town. Instead, I learned from soldiers shouting in the street that you hold some position of authority significant enough to command armed escorts and urgent council meetings. I did not lie to you," Kane said carefully, "though I understand withholding such significant information likely feels equally dishonest given the circumstances. Lyra laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and sharp. I have heard excuses like this before, she said. Different words, same result. Someone allows me to believe in something, only for the truth to reveal an entirely different reality, one where my understanding of the situation was never remotely accurate. Kane stepped closer, though he maintained enough distance to respect the clear tension radiating from her posture. I am the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, he said finally, his voice steady despite the gravity of the admission. I did not share this immediately because I did not want my position to overshadow whatever genuine connection might develop between us. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who value my status above anything resembling my actual character. I hoped, foolishly perhaps, that here in Millhaven, I might discover something different. Lyra stared at him, processing the magnitude of what he had just revealed. The Alpha King represented authority beyond anything she had encountered, even within her own former pack. A position that commanded respect and fear across territories spanning far beyond anything she had previously considered. And what does that make me? She asked quietly. In whatever plans you have constructed around this supposed connection between us. Some convenient distraction during your travels, easily discarded once your counsel demands your return to more important matters? Kane's expression hardened slightly, though not with anger directed toward her. You misunderstand entirely, he said firmly. What exists between us is not something I discovered by convenience, nor is it something I intend to discard regardless of what my counsel or anyone else might prefer. I have waited my entire life for the kind of recognition I experienced the moment I first entered your shop. I will not simply walk away from that because circumstances have grown complicated. Lyra shook her head, old defenses rising instinctively despite the sincerity evident in his words. I built this life alone, she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to maintain composure. I do not need a king, or a mate, or whatever role you believe I am meant to fulfill within your world. I need nothing beyond what I have already created for myself here in Millhaven. Kane studied her carefully, clearly recognizing the depth of pain underlying her resistance, though he made no attempt to argue further in that moment. I understand your hesitation, he said quietly. I will not pressure you into accepting something you are not ready to consider, but I ask that you allow me the opportunity to prove my intentions genuinely, without the assumption that I intend to repeat whatever pain you have clearly carried from your past. He left without waiting for her response, understanding perhaps that pushing further in that moment would accomplish nothing beyond deepening whatever wounds already existed beneath her carefully constructed composure. Lyra remained alone in the back room long after he departed, her mind consumed entirely by the impossible complexity of a situation she had never anticipated encountering when she first arrived in this quiet town 5 years earlier. She had built a life specifically designed to avoid exactly this kind of upheaval, and now that careful construction felt suddenly, dangerously fragile. She did not yet know how she would proceed, whether she possessed the strength to allow herself vulnerability towards someone whose position carried implications far beyond anything she had previously navigated. She knew only that whatever decision she ultimately reached would shape the remainder of her life in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. Days passed, following the revelation of Kane's true identity, and Lyra found herself navigating an unfamiliar tension between her careful instinct toward self-protection and a curiosity she could not fully suppress. Kane had kept his word, maintaining distance from her shop while still remaining somewhere within the town, his soldiers stationed discreetly at its edges, rather than crowding the quiet streets with obvious displays of power. She heard about his presence through Nora, who had somehow befriended one of the younger soldiers stationed nearby, and eagerly shared updates whenever she visited the bakery. He has not left, Nora said one afternoon, settling into her usual chair near the counter. Everyone in town is talking about it. A king, staying in Millhaven of all places, simply because of a woman he claims is his intended. Lyra felt heat rise to her cheeks, uncomfortable with how quickly her private situation had apparently become common knowledge throughout town. It is complicated, she said simply, unwilling to elaborate further despite Nora's obvious curiosity. Complicated seems like quite an understatement, Nora replied, though her tone carried genuine concern, rather than mere gossip seeking satisfaction. Are you all right, Lyra? This all seems rather overwhelming. Lyra considered the question carefully before answering, appreciating that her friend's concern stemmed from genuine care rather than idle curiosity about the dramatic circumstances unfolding around her. "I do not know yet," she admitted honestly. "I built this life specifically to avoid situations exactly like this one. Now everything feels uncertain again, in ways I had convinced myself I would never experience." Nora reached across the counter, placing a comforting hand over Lyra's own. "Whatever you decide," she said gently, "you know your own worth, regardless of what any king or pack or anyone else believes about your value. You built this entire life from nothing, after whatever happened before you arrived here. That strength does not disappear simply because circumstances have grown complicated again." Lyra felt unexpected tears prick at her eyes, grateful for a friendship built entirely outside the complicated politics that now threatened to reshape her carefully ordered existence. That evening, after closing the bakery, Lyra found herself walking toward the edge of town, rather than returning immediately to her small apartment. She needed space to think, distance from the familiar walls that had witnessed so much of her healing over recent years. Room to process everything that had shifted since Kane's arrival. She found him standing near the old stone bridge at the town's edge, seemingly waiting, though she had given him no indication of her intended destination that evening. Perhaps, she considered, whatever bond apparently connected them, carried an awareness beyond conscious intention. "I did not expect to find you here," she said, approaching slowly. Kane turned toward her, his expression carrying careful restraint, despite what she suspected was considerable relief at her presence. "I often come here in the evenings," he replied. "It offers a view of the stars unlike anything available closer to town." Lyra joined him at the bridge's railing, studying the night sky stretching above them in a manner she had rarely paused to appreciate during her years of constant work and careful routine. "Tell me about your life before this," she said finally, surprising herself with the request. "Not as king, simply as yourself." Kane seemed to consider the question carefully before answering, perhaps recognizing the significance of her willingness to engage beyond mere caution. "I became alpha at a young age," he said quietly, "younger than most consider appropriate for such responsibility. My father died unexpectedly, and I inherited authority over territories I barely understood how to manage. I spent years surrounded by advisors and council members who valued my decisions purely through the lens of strategic benefit, rarely considering me as anything beyond a title requiring careful guidance." Lyra listened carefully, recognizing unexpected parallels between his experience and her own. "It sounds lonely," she said quietly. Kane glanced toward her, something vulnerable flickering behind his usual composed expression. "It was," he admitted. "I have spent years believing that loneliness was simply the price required for the authority I held. I never expected to find someone who might understand that particular isolation, let alone someone entirely outside the world I have always known." Lyra felt something shift within her chest, recognition of a loneliness she understood intimately, despite their vastly different circumstances. She had spent 5 years building walls specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of vulnerability now settling between them. Yet standing here beneath the quiet stars, she found those walls considerably harder to maintain. "I was rejected," she said suddenly, the words escaping before she fully decided to share them. "By my fated mate, in front of my entire pack. He chose someone he believed offered greater advantage to his standing, and I was left with nothing beyond public humiliation and a title that marked me as unwanted among my own kind." Kane's expression darkened slightly, though his voice remained gentle when he responded. "Whoever made that choice was a fool beyond measure," he said firmly. "Anyone capable of rejecting someone with your strength and character clearly lacked the wisdom necessary to recognize genuine worth." Lyra felt tears threaten again, though these carried less pain and more relief at finally sharing a burden she had carried silently for years. "I built everything here, specifically because I never wanted to experience that kind of vulnerability again," she continued. "I convinced myself that relying entirely on my own strength was safer than trusting anyone else with my heart." "I understand that instinct completely," Kane said quietly. "I am not asking you to abandon the strength you have built. I am simply asking whether you might consider allowing me space within the life you have already created, rather than expecting you to sacrifice any part of what you have accomplished." Lyra studied him carefully, recognizing genuine sincerity in his words, despite everything still cautioning her against complete trust. "I need more time," she said finally, though her voice carried less certainty than it had during their previous conversation. Kane nodded, understanding evident in his expression. Then I will remain here for as long as necessary, he said simply. Whatever timeline you require. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching stars scatter across the darkening sky, and for the first time since his arrival, Lyra allowed herself to consider the possibility that perhaps not every powerful figure intended to repeat the patterns established by those who had hurt her before. News of the Alpha King's extended stay in Millhaven eventually reached far beyond the town's modest borders, traveling through trade routes and messenger networks, until it found its way to territories Lyra had once called home. It did not take long before Callan Voss learned of the situation, and even less time before ambition convinced him the news presented an opportunity too valuable to ignore. Callan arrived in Millhaven on a gray afternoon, accompanied by 2 attendants who carried themselves with the kind of practiced arrogance typical of those accustomed to lesser positions of influence within larger, more established packs. He made his way directly to the bakery, having gathered enough information through careful inquiry to know precisely where he might find the woman whose rejection had once seemed like a strategic advantage. Lyra felt her blood run cold the moment he stepped through her door, old instincts flaring with a mixture of fear and fury she had not experienced in years. "Well," Callan said, his tone carrying false warmth that failed to mask the calculation beneath it. "This is quite the transformation. From rejected Omega to companion of the Alpha King himself. Fortune has certainly favored you in ways I never anticipated." Lyra straightened her spine, refusing to allow old fear to dictate her response. "What are you doing here, Callan?" she asked, her voice steadier than she expected given the circumstances. "I came to offer my congratulations," he replied smoothly, though the sharpness in his eyes suggested motives far removed from genuine well-wishing. "And perhaps to ensure the Alpha King understands the full context of the woman he apparently intends to elevate to such significant standing." Lyra felt understanding settle coldly within her chest, recognizing immediately the threat underlying his supposedly friendly visit. "Say whatever you came to say," she replied evenly, refusing to allow him the satisfaction of witnessing her fear. Callan smiled, the expression carrying none of the warmth it once might have held for her. "I simply believe His Majesty deserves complete information before making decisions of such consequence," he said. "Perhaps he is unaware that you were once rejected for reasons that seemed entirely justified at the time. Perhaps he should understand the full history before elevating someone previously deemed unsuitable within her own community." Before Lyra could respond, the shop door opened again, and Kane stepped inside, his expression immediately hardening as he assessed the tension evident throughout the room. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying quiet authority that seemed to fill the entire space despite its measured tone. Callan turned toward him, his earlier confidence faltering slightly beneath the weight of Kane's presence, though he attempted to maintain his composure regardless. "My lord," he said, offering a shallow bow that carried more calculation than genuine respect. "I simply came to ensure you possessed complete information regarding the woman you appear to be considering for such significant standing." Kane's expression remained carefully neutral, though Lyra noticed the subtle tension building throughout his posture. "I am quite thoroughly informed about Lyra's character," he replied evenly. "I am curious, however, about what compelled you to travel such considerable distance simply to offer information I never requested." Callan hesitated, clearly recognizing that his strategy had not unfolded quite as he anticipated. "I simply believed," he began, before Kane interrupted with quiet, unmistakable authority. "You believed that reminding her of past humiliation might somehow benefit your own standing," Kane said, his voice carrying an edge sharp enough to make Callan visibly flinch. "I am well aware of what transpired between you and Lyra. I find it remarkable that you would travel this distance believing such history might diminish my regard for her, rather than simply confirming everything I already understand about your own character." Lyra watched, something like awe mixing with her lingering anxiety, as Kane addressed the man who had once destroyed her sense of self-worth with a single public declaration. "Lyra demonstrated strength and resilience that you clearly never possessed the wisdom to recognize," Kane continued. "She rebuilt an entire life from nothing after your rejection, achieving success through nothing beyond her own determination. If anything, your visit today has only confirmed my admiration for everything she has accomplished, despite circumstances you created." Callan's face flushed with embarrassment, his earlier arrogance crumbling beneath Kane's measured response. "I believe it would be wise for you to leave Millhaven immediately," Kane said finally, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "And I would advise considerable caution before attempting anything similar in the future." Callan departed quickly, his attendants following closely behind, leaving Lyra standing in stunned silence as she processed everything that had just unfolded. "You did not need to intervene," she said quietly once the door closed behind them. "I could have handled him myself." Kane turned toward her, his expression softening considerably from the sharp authority he had displayed moments earlier. "I have no doubt you could have," he said gently. "I witnessed your strength the moment you stood your ground against him, refusing to allow fear to dictate your response. I simply could not stand by silently, while someone attempted to diminish everything you have built through nothing beyond petty jealousy and wounded pride." Lyra felt something shift within her, a recognition that Kane's support did not undermine her strength, but rather complemented it, standing beside her, rather than overshadowing her own capability. "Thank you," she said quietly, meaning it more genuinely than she had expected. Kane studied her carefully, something hopeful flickering behind his usual composed expression. "I meant everything I said to him," he added. "Your resilience is remarkable, Lyra. Whatever decision you ultimately reach regarding our situation, I want you to understand that my admiration for you extends far beyond whatever bond exists between us. I see your strength clearly, and I respect it completely." Lyra felt walls she had maintained for years beginning to soften considerably, recognizing perhaps for the first time that allowing someone closer did not necessarily mean sacrificing the independence she had worked so hard to establish. In the weeks following Callan's failed attempt to undermine her standing, Lyra found herself thinking differently about the possibilities Kane represented within her life. The confrontation had revealed something significant, not merely about Kane's character, but about her own capacity to face old wounds without allowing them to define her present circumstances. She began allowing herself more time with Kane, gradually extending their conversations beyond brief exchanges in her shop, toward longer walks, through Millhaven's quiet streets, and evenings spent discussing everything from childhood memories to hopes neither had previously voiced aloud to anyone else. "I never imagined finding someone who understood the particular loneliness of carrying significant responsibility," Kane admitted one evening, as they walked along the river that bordered the eastern edge of town. Lyra glanced toward him, recognizing genuine vulnerability in his admission. "I never imagined trusting anyone again after everything that happened," she replied honestly. "Yet somehow, being near you feels less like risking everything, and more like finally being understood by someone who recognizes exactly what strength required to rebuild from nothing." Kane stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his expression carrying a seriousness that made her breath catch slightly. "I do not wish to rush you toward any decision you are not ready to make," he said carefully. "But I need you to understand that whatever bond exists between us, I consider it a privilege rather than an obligation. I am not asking you to become simply my mate or my queen. I am asking whether you might consider building something together, a partnership where your independence remains entirely intact." Lyra felt tears gathering, though these carried warmth rather than the pain she had grown accustomed to associating with vulnerability. "I have spent 5 years convincing myself that I needed nothing beyond what I built alone," she said quietly. "I am beginning to understand that allowing someone else into that life does not diminish what I accomplished. It simply means I no longer have to carry everything entirely by myself." Kane reached for her hand carefully, giving her every opportunity to withdraw if she chose. She did not withdraw. "I choose this," she said finally, her voice carrying quiet certainty that surprised even herself. "Not because fate demands it, and not because I need someone to complete what I have already built. I choose you because you have shown me, repeatedly, that strength and vulnerability can exist together without one diminishing the other." Kane's expression shifted into something Lyra had never seen from him before, unguarded joy replacing the careful composure he typically maintained. Word of their decision spread quickly through Millhaven, and rather than the judgment Lyra half expected, the town's response carried genuine warmth and celebration. Margaret, now elderly but still sharp as ever, visited the bakery specifically to offer her blessing. "I always suspected there was more to your story than you shared," Margaret said, embracing Lyra warmly. "Whatever path led you here, I am simply grateful it eventually led toward happiness, rather than continued hardship. Nora and Fiona organized a small celebration at the bakery, filling the shop with flowers and treats that Lyra herself had taught them to prepare over the years. Even Owen, typically quiet and reserved, offered genuine congratulations that touched her more deeply than she expected. Kane's council, initially skeptical about their king's unusual choice of mate, gradually came to respect the resilience and character that had drawn their ruler toward Lyra in the first place. When Kane formally presented her to his broader pack council weeks later, he made a point of emphasizing her accomplishments, rather than simply her position as his chosen mate. "This is Lyra Hartwell," he announced before the gathered assembly, "a woman who built an entire life from nothing, after facing rejection that would have destroyed someone with less resilience. She stands before you not merely as my mate, but as someone whose strength and character I deeply respect and admire." The council, though initially reserved, gradually warmed toward her presence, recognizing genuine capability and grace in how she carried herself despite the intimidating weight of her new position. Lyra did not abandon everything she had built in Millhaven. She retained ownership of her bakery, arranging for Fiona and Owen to manage daily operations, while she divided her time between her new responsibilities, alongside Kane, and regular visits to the town that had given her refuge during her most difficult years. She often thought about how far she had traveled since that terrible night, when Callan's rejection had shattered everything she believed about her future. She understood now that the journey, though painful, had ultimately led her toward genuine strength, rather than simple survival. Strength that Kane recognized and valued far more deeply than her previous pack ever had. As months passed and her new life alongside Kane settled into a comfortable rhythm, Lyra found herself reflecting often on the peculiar nature of fate and resilience. She had once believed rejection meant permanent unworthiness, that being cast aside by someone she trusted somehow diminished her value entirely. Instead, that painful rejection had led her toward a life she could never have imagined, one built first through her own determination, and later shared with someone who valued exactly the independence and strength that experience had forged within her. Standing beside Kane during quiet evenings, watching the sun set over territories that now, in some sense, belonged to both of them, Lyra understood that her story was not simply one of rescue or fate delivering happiness after suffering. It was a story of her own resilience, tested through hardship and ultimately rewarded through genuine partnership rather than dependence. She had built a life alone when no one believed she could. She had chosen love again only when she was ready, on her own terms, with someone who respected the strength that solitude had taught her. And in choosing that path deliberately rather than accepting it out of desperation, she discovered that the life she now shared with Kane was infinitely more meaningful than anything she might have settled for, out of fear or convenience. The rejected Omega had become something far greater than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined possible. She had become whole, entirely on her own terms, before allowing anyone else the privilege of standing beside her. The bonding ceremony took place on a clear morning, nearly a year after Kane first walked into Lyra's bakery, held not within the grand halls of his northern territory, but in Millhaven itself, at Lyra's insistence. She wanted the town that had given her refuge to witness the moment her new life truly began, rather than holding the ceremony somewhere she still felt like an outsider among unfamiliar customs. The town square had been transformed for the occasion, strings of lanterns hanging between buildings, tables laden with food prepared by nearly every household in Millhaven. Margaret sat near the front, her weathered hands folded contentedly in her lap, while Nora and Fiona fussed over the final details of Lyra's simple, elegant dress, one she had chosen herself, rather than accepting the elaborate gowns Kane's council had initially suggested. Kane's soldiers stood respectfully at the edges of the gathering, no longer an intimidating show of force but simply protectors, honoring a moment of genuine significance for their king. Garrick, who had grown fond of Millhaven during his extended stay, stood near the front with an expression of quiet pride Lyra had not expected from the normally reserved warrior. As Lyra walked toward Kane through the gathered crowd, she caught sight of familiar faces from every corner of her carefully built life, townsfolk who had known her only as the quiet baker, now witnessing the truth of everything she had overcome to reach this moment. She felt no fear standing before this crowd, none of the crushing humiliation that had once accompanied a similar gathering years earlier. This time, Every face reflected genuine celebration rather than pity or judgment. Kane watched her approach with an expression of open wonder, none of the careful composure he maintained during matters of state visible in this moment. When she finally stood before him, he reached for her hands gently, his voice carrying quiet emotion as he spoke the traditional words binding their futures together. "I choose you, Lyra Hartwell," he said, "not because fate demanded it, but because every day since discovering you, I have chosen you again, and I intend to continue choosing you for the remainder of my life." Lyra felt tears slip freely down her cheeks, unashamed for the first time in years to display such raw emotion before a crowd of witnesses. "I choose you as well," she replied, her voice steady despite the depth of feeling behind her words. "Not because I need someone to complete the life I built, but because you have shown me that love does not require sacrificing the strength I fought so hard to reclaim." The ceremony concluded with celebration stretching long into the evening, laughter and music filling the town square in a manner Millhaven had never before experienced. Lyra danced with Nora and Fiona, embraced Margaret warmly, and later found herself standing quietly beside Kane as the celebration continued around them, watching stars begin to emerge overhead. In the months that followed, Lyra settled into a life divided between two worlds, spending portions of each season within Kane's northern territory, learning the responsibilities that came with her new position as Luna, while regularly returning to Millhaven to oversee her beloved bakery and maintain the friendships that had sustained her through her most difficult years. She approached her new responsibilities with the same determination that had rebuilt her entire life from nothing years earlier, quickly earning respect among Kane's council through her genuine care for those under their protection, rather than simply performing expected duties. She established programs supporting Omegas who had faced similar rejection within their own packs, offering resources and guidance she wished had been available during her own darkest period. Kane, meanwhile, found himself transformed by her presence in ways he had never anticipated. The isolation he once believed inseparable from his position gradually softened, replaced by genuine partnership that made even the most difficult decisions feel less burdensome when shared with someone who understood him completely. Years later, when younger Omegas within their territory faced their own struggles with rejection or uncertainty about their worth, Lyra often shared her story, not as a tale of rescue by a powerful mate, but as evidence that building genuine strength alone, on one's own terms, ultimately created the foundation necessary for healthy, equal partnership rather than desperate dependence. She often returned to her bakery in Millhaven during quiet moments, standing behind the same counter where Kane had first recognized her all those years earlier, remembering the frightened, humiliated young woman who had once walked into this town believing her life had effectively ended. That woman, she understood now, had never truly disappeared. She had simply grown into someone capable of recognizing genuine love when it arrived, precisely because she had first learned to value herself completely on her own. The rejected Omega, who once believed she would never matter to anyone, had become Luna to the most powerful pack in the Northern Territories, not through fate alone, but through her own unwavering determination to rebuild herself from nothing into someone worthy of genuine respect and partnership. And every evening, watching the sun set beside the man who had chosen her not out of obligation, but out of genuine recognition of her worth, Lyra understood completely that her story had never truly been about rejection at all. It had always been about discovering, through hardship and solitude and eventual courage, exactly how strong she had been capable of becoming all along.